You're listening to the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast, where we build healthier lifestyles, elevate your well-being, and transform lives. Welcome to BMI.
I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. I'm a board-certified gastroenterologist and obesity medicine specialist. Thanks for joining me today on the Beyond Measurements and Image podcast. Today we're going to discuss what's called N.E.A.T, Non-Exercise Activity Thermogenesis. So you may ask yourself, what is N.E.A.T? N.E.A.T is essentially all of the activities that you do that aren't associated with your basal metabolic rate, which is just the calories burned to survive, and any physical activity, and then what we call the thermogenesis of food. Have you ever noticed that some people seem to be in constant motion? These people usually are lean as well. Is that because they eat less? Is it because they do more exercise? Or could it possibly be due to this non-exercise activity thermogenesis, this constant movement that ultimately burns calories? In the end, we know for negative weight balance, in other words, to lose weight, we have to burn more calories than we take in. And we've discussed in previous podcasts the role of exercise and how few calories oftentimes are burned with various exercises. And then we've also talked in great detail about changing dietary patterns. But today we're going to talk about this calorie burn that just happens from natural movement. Some people are just wired this way. Some people are just wired to kind of be fidgety and to kind of move, to tap their feet, to tap their hands, to walk, to take stairs, to do these things. Some people are just wired that way. And it's thought that maybe this is hardwired from the hypothalamus. In so many of our podcasts, we've talked about the role of weight control, and it all really seems to stem from the hypothalamus. And there's some research where they're looking at the role of this non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which just means the calories that we're burning from activities that aren't specifically exercise. And so some people are just wired that way, it's thought. And that's not entirely clear, but what we do know are there are things that you can do to modify your behavior if you're not just inclined to do that. So there's some research going on where they're looking at the hypothalamus for this non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And if you're hardwired that way, it comes naturally. But that doesn't mean that if you're not hardwired that way, that you can't make adjustments so that you can capitalize on the calorie burn that you would get from various activities that aren't exercise, and they're not directly related to eating, nor are they directly related to just what we call the basal metabolic expenditure. So let's talk a minute about metabolism. What is metabolism? Metabolism is how we convert the energy from the food that we eat into the energy that we need. And there's three components of it. The first and the biggest component is what we call the basal metabolic rate. And that is the metabolism that is required of our bodies just to maintain, right? Just to breathe 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for year after year after year. And for our heart to beat and for our blood to pump and for all the activities that are required for us just to exist. Just if we were laying in bed or sitting on a couch and doing absolutely nothing, just the functions that our body needs to do to keep us alive. That's what constitutes the basal metabolic rate. And that actually accounts for about 60 to 70% of our calories. The next component of metabolism is what we call the thermogenic effect of food. And that is the energy that's required to break down the food, to digest it, and to absorb it. And then when we do that, then we get into the cycles where we're breaking down carbohydrates, we're taking proteins and breaking them down into their amino acids, and taking fat and breaking it down into the free fatty acids. And then it goes in, ultimately turns into ATP, which is the ultimate currency of energy for the human body. So the thermogenic of food actually takes about 10% of the calories that we eat. So when we take food in, about 10% of the energy from that food is just used to break that food down and to put it to work for us. There's a whole host of diets, and all of them have pros and cons, but one is a high protein diet, and there's multiple benefits to that. For one, protein doesn't tend to be terribly calorie dense. There's not a lot of empty calories like we see with carbohydrates and processed foods. But not only is protein less calorie dense, but it also has a higher thermogenic of food. So it actually requires more of our energy to break it down and to absorb it. So you have the added benefit of taking in fewer calories when you eat protein, but then also of those calories, a bigger percentage of them are going just to the process of breaking it down so that you can absorb it. So that's one of the ways in which a high protein diet is beneficial. Of course, also that protein breaks down into amino acids, which ultimately are used for a host of things, but also help to build muscle and to make us healthier in multiple ways. It's interesting. With the thermogenic effect of food, it appears as though possibly lean people tend to have more benefit from the thermogenic effect of food. So in other words, lean people actually burn more calories in an effort to extract the energy from their food. So it's kind of that typical, the rich get richer. In this case, the lean get leaner. So for metabolism, we've discussed the basal metabolic rate, and we've talked about the thermogenic effect of food. So now we're going to talk about physical activity. Physical activity accounts for about 15 to 30% of the calories that we eat. And this can really be broke down into the exercise component that we've talked about on the previous podcasts. Whether it's running, biking, pickleball, any actual physical activity that's sort of set out to function as a physical activity, whether that's for general health maintenance or weight loss. And then this last component, the topic of today's discussion, is this non-exercise activity thermogenesis. Thermogenesis is just the generation of heat or energy, and it's the fourth component of metabolism. So again, it's basal metabolic rate, the thermogenic effect of food, physical activity in the form of exercise, and then non-exercise activity. So what is it? It is just that. It is all the little movements that we make, all the things that we do throughout the day that aren't specific exercise, right? Whether it's getting up and walking from the desk to the front office, whether it's walking across the room to answer the phone, taking the stairs instead of riding the elevator or the escalator, right? Gardening, chores, just the activities of daily living that actually require some physical input really fall into this category of non-exercise activity. It's estimated that in some people, it could burn up to an additional 2,000 calories per day. And it's really associated with natural movements. In a previous podcast, we talked about the blue zones and the Power 9, the 9 characteristics that Dan Buettner was able to sort out that the 5 different blue zones had in common. And one of those was that they move naturally. And of course, there was no specific data, or I didn't come across any specific data that discussed the weight of these people. But remember, in the blue zones, there was a disproportionate number of centenarians, a disproportionate number of people that lived to be over 100. And I can tell you as a physician, I see a lot of patients that are overweight and obese, and I see a fair amount of patients that are old. But it's extremely uncommon that I see an old patient, meaning 90 or 100 years old, that's overweight or obese. So although I don't know of any specific data in the blue zones that says all of these people are leaner, I think that is a conclusion that we can draw, although maybe not scientifically. But one of the things that we do know from Buettner's evaluation of these zones is that these people move naturally. And that's an example of non-exercise activity of thermogenesis. So how does it work? As we store fat cells, ultimately we have to break that fat down to lose weight. And so our nervous system helps to activate the fat cells for breakdown. So the first thing that has to happen is you have to have mobilization of the fat cells. So as we eat fat and we store it, that's a process called lipogenesis. And we need to break it down, and that becomes a process called lipolysis. And so you have these free fatty acids that are bound together with a glycerol. And when you have 3 of them, you have a triglyceride. And so when you break that down, you break that glycerol bond and basically free the fatty acids. And then they're taken into the cells and they're broken down and ultimately metabolized into ATP for energy. We won't go into all the biochemical processes, but non-exercise activity really is manifest through fatty oxidation. So what are some of the ways that we otherwise mobilize and oxidize fat? Typically, it's done in the form of exercise. So oftentimes people go out and they'll participate in some form of activity with the goal of wanting to lose weight. And they do lose weight, and oftentimes they do lose fat. But it's kind of key at how they do that, right? You would think if you went out and ran, let's say you ran a 5K, right? 3 miles, 3.1 miles. You would think if you went out and did that as fast as you could, as hard as you could, and you had your heart rate up as high as it could go, that you could sustain over that 3 miles, that you would burn more fat. If you thought that, it would make complete sense. But the reality of it is that where you really burn fat is when you're in zone 2 heart rate. How do you determine your zone 2 heart rate? A general rule of thumb is you take 220 and you subtract your age. So let's just say, for example, that you're a 40-year-old. So you take 220, you subtract 40, that's 180. And then 60 to 70% of that is 108 to 126. So actually, you get more fat mobilization and oxidation if you run that 5K in zone 2. right? Where your heart isn't racing, but you're pushing it. You're getting it out of your normal heart rate and kind of moving it up into that next level. That's where you begin to metabolically get yourself into that zone where you're breaking down fat, you're mobilizing it, and you're starting to oxidize it. And that's why oftentimes endurance activities, marathons or ultra marathons or long bike rides, that's why a lot of times those are very effective at burning fat. If you're doing an ultra marathon, let's just use that for an example. And I know that most of us aren't doing ultra marathons, but let's say you're doing a 30-mile run. Oftentimes these ultra marathons are on trails. They're not on pavements. So if you go do a marathon or a half marathon, a lot of times you're on a pavement and you're sort of racing it, right? You're running it as fast as you can. Now that doesn't mean that, you're running it at full tilt, but you're running it as fast as you can to sustain over the course of time to get that 13 or 26 miles or whatever it is. But when you do these longer events, and maybe a half marathon is a longer event for you, but when you do it and you're running it, you're not racing it, then you tend to kind of do it at a more leisurely pace. Obviously, you're not walking. You're not going to go out and walk a half marathon necessarily, or a trail run or any of these things. But if you do it where you're exercising it up to about 60 to 70% of your maximum heart rate, even though you're not necessarily specifically set out to do that. But if you do that, that's where you really get into this fat mobilization and oxidation. What other things can you do? Well, if you fast greater than about 6 to 8 hours, then your body tends to go into more fat mobilization and oxidation because it wants to preserve the glucose that it has, because the brain really requires glucose for optimum functioning. It's interesting, if you ingest a big carbohydrate meal before an endurance event, your body will preferentially burn the carbohydrate first, and then it will go into fat oxidation. And then at some point it'll switch back. But oftentimes people will, take a GU or a product, or they'll eat a big carbohydrate load the night before a big event, which is fine because you need the energy in whatever form. And glucose is the simplest energy to break down, provide readily available energy to your muscles. But if you have a big carbohydrate meal before an event, your body will preferentially use that for energy before fat stores. So those are the typical ways that our body functions to mobilize and oxidize fat to turn it into ATP for energy. So what are we doing now that we can change? Well, let's think about a typical day. First of all, I want to give credit to a great book, Dr. James Levine. He's an MD, PhD at the Mayo Clinic, and he's sort of the expert on non-exercise activity of thermogenesis. Hope one day we can have him on the podcast. But he wrote an outstanding book called Get Up, Why Your Chair is Killing You and What You Can Do About It. And he goes in there and he really outlines the fact that we've become an incredibly sedentary society. He puts it all on the chair, right? He really focuses how we've converted ourselves from an active species, kind of running around, hunting and gathering and doing the things that we did as a society before, to now we're in this, industrial complex where everything is based on efficiency and productivity. And we sit in these chairs all day long. And it's a fascinating book. I highly recommend it. And I hope you guys get the opportunity to read it. But he describes a typical day. And you think about it, you lay in bed for 8 hours and then you get up, you take a shower, and then you go downstairs. And oftentimes the first thing you do is you sit at the table to eat your breakfast. And then you get ready, get up, you go to your car, you sit in your car, you drive to work, you go into work, you sit at your desk. And potentially you sit at your desk for hours and hours. It's only getting more prevalent that we sit because of computers. And so he goes in and just outlines all the things that society has done. He talks about how they put casters on chairs so that you wouldn't have to get out of your chair. You could just slide your chair around the office. So you could slide over to the copier and you could slide back over to your desk, or you could slide across without having to get up and actually burn calories. Now, the intention wasn't not to burn calories. The intention was just to be more efficient for the company. It was all predicated on the ideas of an economy of motion that ultimately led to productivity, which probably from a business perspective is accurate, but the detriment has been incredible. So then he talks about sitting in the chair all day, maybe getting up at lunch, going to eat, sitting in the cafeteria or sitting in the restaurant of your choice, and then getting in your car, sitting in your car, driving home. You get home, what's the thing that most people do? They sit on the couch or they sit in their recliner. They turn on the TV and they sit until it's time for bed. By doing that, you've eliminated all of this non-exercise activity of thermogenesis. You're simply at that point basically tapping into your basal metabolic rate, right? You're just functioning. You're not really necessarily getting a lot done. The book is really interesting, but he goes in and he talks about all the things that the chair has sort of led our species to do and what detriment that has come with it. So like was mentioned earlier, there's some research going on to see if some people are just hardwired to move. And I think that we know for sure that some people are more active than others. And I would suggest that probably when you look around and when you start paying attention to these people that are super active, they're probably also super lean because they just happen to be wired that way and they get the benefit of burning all these extra calories. It's estimated up to 2,000 calories a day just in this non-exercise activity. If you're not one that's wired that way and you're trying to lose weight, what are some of the things that you can do? One of the big things that can be done is you can stand versus sitting. There's not a huge difference in the calorie burn. So when you sit, it's estimated that you'd burn about 85 calories versus standing maybe as much as 100. So that's not a lot. But if you're standing, you are burning extra calories that you just wouldn't necessarily be burning if you were sitting. And then just doing little things like getting up and walking across the office to answer the phone or going to the front desk, taking the steps when you can. All these things, all these little movements. Dr. Levine actually is the originator of the treadmill desk. So not only does he research this, but he practices it. And he's actually gone into different work environments and converted the offices into mobile spaces, what he calls, neat spaces. He's gone into schools and done the same thing and actually shown over time that it does lead to increased non-energy activity thermogenesis and that the calorie burn is greater in these people. And this is done scientifically with significant research. In addition to doing these things, he practices what he preaches. So he actually designed a stand-up desk and then ultimately designed a treadmill desk. So it's not uncommon, apparently, that Dr. Levine gets on his treadmill desk and walks while he's talking, while he's conducting business. And then if he doesn't have to be at his desk, of course, he's walking around doing these things. So standing versus sitting, walking, just general fidgeting. In our current society, we diagnose people with ADHD and then we medicate them, right? We medicate them so that they don't fidget. It's interesting, though, the medications that we medicate them with are stimulants that then in turn suppress those people's appetite. So oftentimes these kids that are diagnosed with ADHD or even adults, they tend to be very lean because they're taking these chronic stimulant medications that ultimately decreases their appetite. But it also suppresses so much. It suppresses so much of who they are, and it decreases their drive to necessarily want to participate in this non-energy activity thermogenesis. So what else? Chores, just doing daily chores, mowing the yard, taking the stairs. All of these things are examples of non-energy activity thermogenesis. And we also know from the research is that N.E.A.T leads to better cardiovascular health, improved cognitive function, a general better disposition. So there's a lot of benefits not only from a weight loss perspective, but just overall general health and well-being. One of the most interesting things that I read while studying up for this was the role of postprandial walking. So they went in and they looked at a group of people. I think they were all diabetics. I think they were all type 1 diabetics. But I think we can extrapolate this to all of society. But they went in and they had very tight controls on the dietary intakes, on the caloric intake of patients. Now, this was in the early days of these glucose monitors. These glucose monitors are now becoming very common where you attach an on-body device and it goes into the subcutaneous tissue and then it's a Bluetooth to your phone and it gives you sort of a real-time reading of your blood sugar. So they had this type of device and they would control the dietary intake. They would control the nutrition that these people took in, let's just say, a lunch. And they knew exactly how much they were taking. And then they would follow their blood sugars because they'd have these instantaneous readings of their blood sugars and they would watch it. And they would just have them eat and then go sit down. And then what they found was that the blood sugars rose substantially. And then a few days later, they would do the exact same meal, the exact same caloric intake, but they would have the patients go walk for 15 minutes or for 30 minutes. And they would look at the blood sugars over that period of time. And what they found was there was about a 50% decrease. The peak of the blood sugar in those patients that ate the exact same meal went up about half as much if they went and walked right after they ate versus if they went and sat down right after they ate. So think of all the things you can do throughout the day, right? You could stand and not sit, and you can take the stairs, and you can do all this. But the other thing that would really be beneficial is if you would make a habit of eating and then getting up and going for a walk. If you have an hour for lunch, if you could take 20 minutes to eat and then spend 30 minutes walking, that would be a fantastic way to help build in some non-exercise activity of thermogenesis. Then that also helps to raise your basal metabolic rate, which then just gives you a sustained caloric burn over time. And you couple that with a little bit of caloric restriction and maybe some other physical activity, and you're just further and further on your way to hitting your goals, whether it be weight loss or general health maintenance. So I think that's all I have today to discuss about the non-exercise activity of thermogenesis and the changes that we can make. These are easy and small little changes that we can make that over time just help to build in and advance us toward our goal of a healthier lifestyle. I think we would feel better doing it. We would probably sleep better. We definitely would start working toward our goals. And most of this doesn't require a significant amount of change. It just makes us a little more active and gets us out of that chair. Again, Dr. Levine is the expert on that. I'd highly recommend you look at his articles if you like to read medical literature, or his book, Get Up. It is a fantastic read. So that's all I have for this. Thanks for joining me. I'm your host, Dr. Drew Crawford. Join me next week as we go beyond measurements and image to build healthier lifestyles and elevate your well-being on the BMI podcast. See you then. The BMI podcast is provided for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute providing medical advice or professional services. Be sure to check out our description below for our website and social media platforms.